The silver droplets sliding down Vexera's pale blue cheeks were her ultimate betrayal. They reflected the ceremonial lights, drawing unwanted attention from the council of elders who stood motionless on the raised platform. On Navia, such a display was more than inappropriate, it was evidence of defect. "Contain yourself, Science Officer Vexera," Elder Morit's voice cut through the silence, devoid of any inflection. His angular features remained perfectly composed, as was proper for their species. "Your emotional lapse dishonors the memory of head researcher Davin." Vexera straightened her slender frame, wiping away the tears with trembling fingers. "I apologize for my failure, honored elder. I will report for remedial suppression training immediately." But it was too late. The gathered crowd of Navians had already witnessed her shame. Their identical expressions of cool disapproval felt like a physical weight pressing against her chest, making it even harder to regain control. This wasn't her first offense. Since childhood, Vexera had struggled with what her people called excessive emotional response syndrome. In a society that valued logic and emotional control above all else, her tendency toward empathy and emotional expression marked her as deficient. For years, she had undergone neural recalibration, meditation regimens, and biochemical treatments, all in an attempt to correct what her people saw as a fundamental flaw in her neural pathways. "The Council has reached a decision," Elder Morith announced after a brief consultation with the other 6 elders. "Science Officer Vexera, your repeated failures to maintain proper emotional discipline despite extensive remediation suggest an irreparable neural divergence. You are hereby reassigned to Outpost Epsilon on the border planet Terra Nova. There, your scientific abilities may still serve some purpose, while your condition will not contaminate others. Exile." Not officially, of course. Navians were too logical to punish someone for what they considered a biological defect. But everyone understood the reality. Outpost Epsilon was where they sent those who couldn't conform, isolating them far from proper Navian society. 3 standard cycles later, Vexera stood at the viewport of the transport vessel as it approached Terra Nova. The planet's blue-green surface seemed to mock her with its chaotic, untamed beauty, so unlike the carefully ordered landscapes of Navia. "We arrive at Outpost Epsilon in 20 minutes, the pilot announced without looking at her. "Your quarters have been prepared in the segregated section. Human personnel have been informed of your arrival." Vexera nodded, clutching her small case of possessions. "Thank you." The pilot raised an eyebrow at her expression of gratitude, another emotional indulgence, but said nothing more. Outpost Epsilon was a sprawling complex of prefabricated structures nestled at the edge of a vast, iridescent forest. As the transport landed, Vexera noted the distinctive architecture that marked the human section of the facility, organic curves and unnecessary aesthetic elements that no practical Navian would waste resources creating. Station Director Trell, another Navian, Defective, greeted her with the barest hint of sympathy in his eyes, something that would have been scandalous on their homeworld but was apparently common here. "Science Officer Vexera, welcome to Epsilon," he said, almost managing the proper emotional neutrality but failing in the slight softening of his voice. "You'll be working primarily with the Xenobotany team, assisting the human researchers with categorizing Terra Nova's plant species." "I understand," Vexera replied, fighting to keep her own voice level. "When do I begin?" "Tomorrow. Today, familiarize yourself with the station layout and protocols." Trell hesitated, then added in a lower tone, "A word of advice, the humans here, they express emotions freely. It can be overwhelming at first. Do not judge them by Navian standards." As Trell led her through the station, Vexera caught glimpses of humans in the connecting corridors, laughing, arguing, embracing. Each display sent a shameful thrill through her, a forbidden fascination with their uninhibited expressions. That night, alone in her sparse quarters, Vexera allowed herself to weep openly for the first time in her life. There was no one to witness her defect, no one to report her failure. As the tears flowed, she felt something unexpected: relief. Tomorrow, she would meet the humans who might see her not as defective, but simply as different. And for the first time since childhood, Vexera permitted herself to feel something dangerously close to hope. The xenobotany lab hummed with activity as Vexera entered, her steps hesitant but measured. Unlike Navaean research facilities with their sterile precision, this space buzzed with organized chaos, specimens scattered across tables, holographic displays flickering with taxonomic data, and the soft background of what humans called music. "You must be our new Navaean colleague," a deep voice called from behind a tall shelf of glowing plant samples. A human male emerged, wiping his hands on his lab coat. He was tall for his species, with warm brown skin and dark curly hair cut short at the sides. What caught Vexera's attention was his smile, open, genuine, with no attempt to conceal the emotion behind it. "I'm Ethan Foster, lead xenobotanist," he said, extending his hand in the human greeting custom. Vexera stared at the offered hand before cautiously reaching out. "Science Officer Vexera," she replied, flinching slightly at the warmth of his touch. Physical contact was rare among her people. "Just Vexera is fine," Ethan said, his eyes, a striking green that reminded her of Terra Nova's forests, crinkling at the corners. "We're pretty informal here." Throughout the morning, Vexera observed Ethan with scientific curiosity. He worked with precision but frequently paused to express excitement over discoveries, frustration at setbacks, or amusement at his own mistakes. The other humans maintained a respectful distance from her, clearly briefed on Navaean cultural norms, but Ethan seemed undeterred by her rigid posture and clipped responses. "This specimen exhibits unusual bioluminescent properties," Vexera noted, analyzing a fern-like plant under a molecular scanner. "Amazing, isn't it?" Ethan moved beside her, close enough that she could detect the subtle scent of his skin. "The entire ecosystem here communicates through light patterns. It's like a planetary conversation we're just beginning to understand." The enthusiasm in his voice triggered an unexpected response in Vexera, a flutter of shared excitement she quickly suppressed. "A scientifically significant discovery," she acknowledged flatly. Ethan tilted his head, studying her with surprising perception. "You know, you don't have to do that around me." "Do what, Dr. Foster?" "Push down whatever you're feeling." His voice softened. "I've worked with Navaeans before. I know about your society's views on emotional expression, but this isn't Navaea." Heat rose to Vexera's cheeks, another betrayal of her defect. "My emotional control deficiency is well documented. It is why I was sent here." Ethan's expression shifted to something she couldn't quite identify. "A deficiency? Is that what they told you?" He shook his head. "From a human perspective, the ability to feel and express emotions isn't a flaw, it's what gives life meaning." The concept was so contrary to everything Vexera had been taught that she found herself momentarily speechless. In the days that followed, Ethan became her unexpected guide, not just to Terra Nova's botanical wonders, but to a new perspective on her supposed defect. He invited her to join research expeditions into the luminous forests, where they worked side by side collecting specimens. On their third expedition, a sudden downpour trapped them in a small research shelter. As thunder shook the structure, Vexera felt panic rising within her, an emotional response she would normally fight to suppress. "It's okay to be frightened," Ethan said gently, noticing her rigid posture and rapid breathing. "Storms can be scary, even for humans who grew up with them." "Navaeans do not experience fear," she recited automatically. Ethan's laugh was warm, not mocking. "Of course they do. They just pretend not to." He moved closer, offering comfort without forcing contact. "Fear is useful, it keeps us safe. Pretending not to feel it doesn't make you stronger, understanding it does." Something in his words cracked a wall within Vexera. "My whole life, I have been told that my emotions make me broken." Her voice trembled. Yet you speak of them as though they are valuable. They are, Ethan said simply. They're what connect us to each other, to the universe around us. His eyes held hers. I've met many Nevians, all working so hard to show nothing. But none of them felt as alive as you do, even when you're trying to hide it. When a particularly loud thunderclap made Vexera jump, Ethan reached out instinctively, his hand covering hers. The touch sent a shock through her system, not unpleasant, but overwhelming in its immediacy. Instead of pulling away, she found herself turning her hand to lace her fingers with his. This is inappropriate, she whispered, even as her fingers tightened around his. By whose standards? Ethan's thumb traced gentle circles on her skin. Not mine. They remained that way until the storm passed, hand in hand in the dim light of the shelter. For Vexera, it was more intimate than any experience in her life, this simple, physical acknowledgement of another being's presence and comfort. Back at the outpost, Vexera found herself drawn to Ethan in ways that confounded her logical mind. She began to notice details about him, the way sunlight caught in his hair, how his voice deepened when he was passionate about a discovery, the gentle patience in his hands as he worked with delicate specimens. One evening, as they catalogued the day's findings, Ethan asked, "Do you miss Navia?" The question startled her. It would be illogical to experience emotional attachment to a location. But do you? He persisted gently. Vexera hesitated, then allowed herself to answer honestly. No. There, I was constantly failing, constantly defective. Here. She struggled to find the words. Here, my defect seems less important. It's not a defect, Vexera. Ethan's voice was firm but kind. It's just part of who you are. And from where I'm standing, who you are is pretty remarkable. As his words washed over her, Vexera felt something bloom in her chest, warm and frightening in its intensity. For the first time, she wondered if the tears that had condemned her might instead be the first drops of her liberation. The research station's observation deck offered the most spectacular view on Outpost Epsilon. At night, the bioluminescent forest stretched to the horizon like a sea of colored stars, pulsing with gentle rhythms that scientists still struggled to decode. It was here that Vexera found herself drawn during off-duty hours, watching the natural light show with a sense of wonder she no longer tried to suppress. I thought I might find you here, Ethan's voice came from behind her. He carried 2 steaming mugs of what humans called tea. Mind some company? Yours is always welcome, Vexera admitted, accepting the offered drink. The admission would have been scandalous on Navia. Expressing preference for an individual's presence was considered inappropriately personal. Ethan settled beside her, closer than Navian social protocols would permit. Over the past weeks, Vexera had grown accustomed to his proximity, even finding comfort in it. The forest is particularly active tonight, she observed, gesturing to the swirling patterns of blue and green light below. Mating season for the luminous sprites, Ethan explained. Those tiny flying creatures that pollinate the glow ferns. They create elaborate light displays to attract partners. A beautiful evolutionary adaptation, Vexera said softly. And incredibly romantic, Ethan added with a smile. Those little creatures put their whole heart into those displays, showing their potential mates exactly who they are. Vexera turned to study his profile, illuminated by the forest's glow. On Navia, reproductive partnerships are arranged based on genetic compatibility and professional standing. No romance at all? Ethan asked, meeting her gaze. Romance is considered an inefficient emotional indulgence. She hesitated, then added, what is it like? To choose a partner based on feelings? Ethan's expression softened. It's terrifying and wonderful. You make yourself vulnerable, revealing your true self to another person, hoping they'll accept you, flaws and all. It sounds frightening, Vexera whispered. It is. But it's also the most alive you can feel. Ethan set his mug down, turning to face her fully. "Vexera, may I ask you something personal?" She nodded, her heartbeat accelerating. "Have you ever been kissed?" The question sent a flush of heat across her pale blue skin. "Physical affection is not practiced among my people outside of reproductive necessity." Ethan's gaze dropped briefly to her lips. "Would you like to know what it's like?" Something both terrifying and thrilling uncoiled within her. "I would," she breathed. Ethan moved slowly, giving her time to retreat. His hand came up to gently cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the high arch of her cheekbone. The touch alone was enough to make her tremble. When his lips finally met hers, the sensation was unlike anything Vexera had experienced, soft, warm, electric. Her eyes fluttered closed as instinct took over. Her hands found their way to his shoulders, then slid up to tangle in his curly hair. The kiss deepened, and Vexera felt herself drowning in new sensations, the taste of him, the slight scratch of evening stubble against her skin, the quiet sound of pleasure that escaped his throat. When they finally parted, both breathless, Vexera found herself trembling. Tears welled in her eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming intensity of what she felt. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked, concern etching his features. "I didn't mean to upset you." "I am not upset," she assured him, letting the tears fall freely. "I am experiencing too much to contain." "These are different tears." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "Happy tears?" She nodded, a smile breaking through. "I never knew such feelings existed. My people, they miss so much." That night marked a turning point. In the weeks that followed, Vexera and Ethan's relationship deepened beyond professional collaboration. He introduced her to human concepts like dates, private meals where they learned about each other's lives, walks through the station's arboretum where they spoke of dreams and hopes, evenings spent listening to earth music that stirred emotions Vexera had never allowed herself to name. With each day, she felt more layers of her conditioning fall away. She began to laugh openly at Ethan's jokes, to express frustration when experiments failed, to debate passionately when they disagreed on research interpretations. Each emotional expression felt like reclaiming a piece of herself that had been locked away. One evening, after they had shared a meal in Ethan's quarters, the air between them changed, charged with unspoken desire. Vexera had been researching human intimacy, curious about the physical expressions of connection that her society had reduced to clinical reproduction. "I want to know all of you," she said simply, her hand reaching for his. Ethan's eyes darkened. "Are you sure?" "There's no rush." "I have denied myself feeling for my entire life," Vexera replied. "I do not wish to deny myself any longer." Their coming together was a revelation. Ethan's hands mapped her body with reverent wonder, discovering the subtle differences between their species, the faint luminescent patterns that appeared on her skin when aroused, the heightened sensitivity along the ridges of her spine. Vexera explored him with equal fascination, marveling at the heat of his skin, the strength in his shoulders, the way his breath caught when she touched him just so. When they finally joined, Vexera understood why her people feared such intimacy. In that moment of connection, all pretense fell away. There was nowhere to hide, no emotions to suppress. She was utterly vulnerable, utterly seen, and in that vulnerability, she found a freedom she had never known existed. Afterward, as they lay tangled together, Ethan traced the now fading luminescent patterns on her shoulder. "You literally glow when you're happy," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her collarbone. "Another defect," she said, but without the shame that once would have accompanied such an admission. "Another wonder," Ethan corrected. "You're perfect exactly as you are, Vexera." As she drifted to sleep in his arms, Vexera realized that for the first time in her life, she was beginning to believe it might be true. Her tears, her laughter, her capacity for love, perhaps these weren't flaws to be corrected but gifts to be cherished. And in Ethan's embrace, she had found not just acceptance but celebration of the very qualities her world had deemed defective. The message arrived without warning, its official Navian government seal flashing on Vexera's terminal with cold authority. She stood frozen, staring at the notification while the laboratory continued its usual bustling activity around her. "What's wrong?" Ethan asked, noticing her sudden stillness. Vexera's voice emerged strained. "A diplomatic delegation from Navia will arrive at Outpost Epsilon tomorrow. They wish to inspect our xenobotanical research and evaluate the condition of Navian personnel stationed here." Ethan's expression darkened with understanding. In the 3 months since they had become lovers, Vexera had blossomed. She now spoke with animation, laughed openly with human colleagues, and even cried during particularly moving passages of the Earth literature Ethan had introduced her to. The transformation was beautiful to witness, but would be considered a deterioration by Navian standards. "They can't force you to go back," Ethan said, moving closer protectively. "They can. Under interplanetary convention, they have the right to recall their citizens, especially those deemed." She swallowed. "Medically compromised." That night, they lay awake in Ethan's quarters, his arms wrapped tightly around her as if he could physically prevent her from being taken. "I won't let them take you," he whispered fiercely against her hair. Vexera traced the contours of his face, memorizing every detail. "You don't understand Navian society, Ethan. They believe they would be helping me. In their eyes, my emotional expression is a neurological disorder causing me suffering." "But are you suffering?" His green eyes searched hers. "No." A smile touched her lips. "For the first time in my life, I am truly alive." The delegation arrived with typical Navian precision, 3 senior officials disembarking from their sleek vessel exactly at the scheduled time. Their tall, slender forms moved with measured grace, faces composed in the practiced neutrality that Vexera now recognized as a prison rather than an achievement. Station Director Trell greeted them with carefully controlled formality, though Vexera noticed the subtle tension in his shoulders. Like her, he had found a degree of freedom in this remote outpost. Senior Evaluator Nexil, Trell acknowledged the leader with a shallow bow. "Outpost Epsilon welcomes the Navian delegation." Evaluator Nexil's pale eyes surveyed the landing bay without expression. "We will begin our assessment immediately. Please arrange for all Navian personnel to report for evaluation within the hour." The evaluation process was clinical and thorough. Vexera sat rigid in the examination chamber as Nexil and his assistants conducted neural scans, blood chemistry analyses, and psychological assessments. She tried to maintain the emotional control expected of her, but found herself struggling after months of allowing herself to feel freely. "Your neural patterns show significant deviation from your last assessment on Navia," Nexil noted, studying the holographic display. "Emotional regulation centers are showing increased activity consistent with advanced emotional expression syndrome." "I have been performing my duties efficiently," Vexera countered, keeping her voice level despite the fear building inside her. "Your research output has been adequate," Nexil conceded. "However, your condition appears to have progressed rather than stabilized. The Council will be disappointed." That evening, the delegation requested a tour of the xenobotany laboratory. Ethan had been warned to maintain professional distance, but Vexera could see the barely contained anger in the set of his jaw as he demonstrated their research findings. "These plant extracts show remarkable regenerative properties," he explained, his usual enthusiasm carefully muted. Science Officer Vexera's analysis of their molecular structure was crucial to our understanding. Nexil observed the samples with detached interest. "And you work closely with Science Officer Vexera?" "She is an invaluable member of our research team," Ethan replied neutrally. The tension in the laboratory was palpable until one of Nexil's assistants accidentally knocked over a container of rapidly growing seedlings. Before she could stop herself, Vexera cried out in dismay, months of careful cultivation scattered across the floor. The sudden emotional outburst caused all three Navian officials to turn to her, their expressions showing rare surprise before quickly returning to neutral. "I see," Nexil said quietly. "Perhaps your condition is even more advanced than our scans indicated." Later that night, Vexera was summoned to the delegation's temporary quarters. Her heart pounding, she squeezed Ethan's hand before leaving him in the corridor. "Science Officer Vexera," Nexil began once they were alone, "our assessment is complete. Your emotional dysregulation has progressed to a concerning degree. We are prepared to transport you back to Navia for intensive neural recalibration." Vexera's throat tightened. "And if I decline?" "Decline?" Nexil's brow furrowed slightly, the most expression she had seen from him. "This is not a request. It is a medical intervention for your benefit." "I do not consider my condition harmful," Vexera stated, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I have found that emotional expression enhances my research capabilities and personal well-being." Nexil studied her for a long moment. "Your time among humans has clearly affected your judgment. However, if you insist on refusing treatment, there is an alternative." His voice cooled further. "Permanent exile. Your Navian citizenship would be revoked. You would never be permitted to return home." The words hit Vexera like a physical blow. Despite everything, Navia was her birthplace, her heritage. Permanent exile meant never seeing the crystal forests of her homeland again, never having the chance to reconnect with family members who might someday understand. "There is another matter," Nexil continued. "We have observed your inappropriate relationship with the human researcher. Such cross-species romantic entanglements are strictly prohibited for Navian citizens." Vexera's control finally slipped. "My relationship with Ethan is not inappropriate. He accepts me as I am, without trying to fix me." "Your emotional outburst only confirms our diagnosis," Nexil replied calmly. "You have until tomorrow morning to decide, return to Navia for treatment, or face permanent exile." When she emerged from the meeting, Ethan was waiting. One look at her face told him everything. "They know about us," she said quietly as they walked back to his quarters. "They've given me a choice, return for treatment or accept permanent exile from Navia." Ethan pulled her into his arms, his heartbeat strong against her cheek. "What do you want to do?" "I don't know," she whispered, tears flowing freely now. "If I return, they will erase everything I've become, everything we've shared. But exile means losing my world forever." Ethan gently lifted her chin, his eyes fierce with determination. "Whatever you choose, I'm with you. If you need to go back, I'll find a way to follow. If you stay, we'll build a new home together." He pressed his forehead to hers. "But know this, what your people call a defect, I call your soul. And I love every part of it." As night fell over Outpost Epsilon, Vexera stood at the familiar observation deck, watching the lights of the forest below. Tomorrow would bring the most difficult choice of her life, between the world that had shaped her and the freedom she had only just discovered. Morning arrived with the gentle amber light that distinguished Terra Nova's dawns. Vexera had not slept. Instead, she and Ethan had talked through the night, weighing possibilities, sharing fears and hopes, holding each other as if memorizing the feeling. Her decision had crystallized sometime in those quiet hours. Now, as she dressed in her formal Navian uniform for perhaps the last time, her hands no longer trembled. The woman who stared back at her from the mirror was not the same one who had arrived at Outpost Epsilon in disgrace. Her eyes held a certainty that came not from suppressing emotions, but from finally understanding their worth. "You're sure about this?" Ethan asked, adjusting her collar with tender precision. "Yes," Vexera replied, covering his hand with hers. "For the first time in my life, I am entirely sure." The meeting chamber had been arranged according to Navian protocol, austere and functional. The delegation stood in perfect formation, their expressions carefully blank as Vexera entered. To her surprise, several other defective Navians from the outpost had gathered at the back of the room, including Director Trell. Even more unexpectedly, many of the human staff had assembled as well, with Ethan taking a position near the door. Science Officer Vexera, Evaluator Nexel began formally, "You have been granted time to consider your options. What is your decision?" Vexera stood tall, her gaze unwavering. "Before I answer, I request permission to address the delegation and those assembled." A flicker of annoyance crossed Nexel's face, quickly suppressed, but noticeable to Vexera who had learned to read such subtle cues. "Proceed, but be concise." "All my life," Vexera began, her voice clear and steady, "I have been told that my emotional responses were a defect, a failure of proper Navian development. I believe this narrative. I hated myself for my tears, for my laughter, for every feeling that escaped my control." She moved to the center of the room, conscious of all eyes upon her. "My assignment to Outpost Epsilon was meant to minimize the damage my condition could cause to Navian society. Instead, it revealed a truth I had never considered: what if our society is wrong?" A murmur rippled through the Navian observers. Nexel's posture stiffened further. "The humans I have worked alongside demonstrate that emotional expression and scientific excellence are not mutually exclusive. They feel deeply, they love, they grieve, they celebrate, and these experiences enhance their understanding of the universe rather than diminishing it." Vexera turned to face her fellow Navians directly. "I have discovered that my tears are not evidence of weakness but of profound strength. To feel is to connect, to the world around us, to each other, to the fundamental truths of existence that cannot be captured through logic alone." She could see uncertainty in the eyes of some younger Navians in the delegation, a hesitation that suggested her words had found purchase. "What you call a defect, I now recognize as my greatest gift. My emotional capacity allows me to intuit connections in our research that purely logical analysis might miss. It enables empathy that strengthens collaborative work. It has led me to discover love, a force as real and powerful as any quantifiable energy in our scientific models." Vexera moved to stand beside Ethan, taking his hand openly. "I choose exile," she stated firmly. "Not because I reject Navia, but because I embrace the truth of who I am. I will no longer apologize for my emotions or treat them as a condition to be cured." The silence that followed was profound. Then, to everyone's surprise, Director Trell stepped forward. "I too choose to remain in exile," he announced, a tremor in his voice betraying the momentous nature of his declaration. Science Officer Vexera speaks a truth many of us have felt but feared to acknowledge. One by one, other Navian defectives stepped forward, adding their voices to the unexpected rebellion. Even more astonishing was the reaction of the youngest member of the delegation, a junior evaluator named Taris, who broke formation to approach Vexera. "Is it true?" he asked quietly, his perfect composure slipping to reveal genuine curiosity. "That emotional expression enhances your research rather than hindering it?" "It is," Vexera confirmed gently. "When we deny part of ourselves, we limit our potential. Integration brings strength, not weakness." Evaluator Nexel's voice cut through the murmurs. "This demonstration is inappropriate and confirms the contagious nature of emotional dysregulation." Junior Evaluator Taris returned to formation immediately. But Taris hesitated, conflict visible in his eyes. "Honored Evaluator, perhaps we should consider the scientific validity of these claims. If emotional capacity truly enhances cognitive function in some contexts, suppression might be counterproductive to our advancement." Nexel's composure finally cracked, a flash of anger quickly controlled but noticed by all. The irony was not lost on the observers. In his moment of emotional response, the chief proponent of emotional suppression had demonstrated the universal nature of feelings. This discussion is concluded, Nexil announced. Those who choose exile will have their citizenship formally revoked. A report will be filed with the Council of Elders. He gestured to his remaining loyal staff. We depart immediately. As the delegation withdrew, the atmosphere in the chamber transformed. Human colleagues approached the Navian exiles with expressions of support, while Ethan pulled Vexera into an embrace that defied all Navian protocols. "I'm proud of you," he whispered against her hair. Later, as they watched the Navian vessel depart from the observation deck, Vexera felt an unexpected peace settle over her. The silvery tears that had once marked her as defective now flowed freely, catching the light of Terra Nova's setting sun. "Do you regret your decision?" Ethan asked, his arms secure around her waist. Vexera shook her head. "No. I believe we have started something important today." "Did you see the faces of the younger delegates? They were questioning. That is how change begins." "You might have just sparked a revolution on your homeworld," Ethan mused. "Not a revolution of conflict," Vexera corrected, "but of awakening. There will be others like me, like us, who recognize that emotional capacity is not a flaw to be corrected but a gift to be cherished." As if to confirm her words, Director Trell approached with Junior Evaluator Taris, who had made the shocking decision to remain behind when his delegation departed. "Evaluator Taris has requested to join our research team," Trell explained, a hint of a smile visible on his usually composed features. "He wishes to explore alternative perspectives on Navian neurological development." "I have questions," Taris admitted, his formal demeanor not quite hiding his eagerness. "Many questions." Vexera extended her hand in the human gesture of welcome that had once seemed so foreign to her. "Questions are where all good science begins." That night, in the privacy of their quarters, Vexera and Ethan made love with a new freedom. Their union was both a celebration and a promise, of acceptance, of possibility, of a future where difference was valued rather than feared. "I love you," Vexera whispered against Ethan's lips, the words still new and precious on her tongue. "Not despite my defect but because of who it allows me to be." Ethan's hands traced the luminescent patterns that bloomed across her skin, his touch reverent. "You were never defective, Vexera. You were just brave enough to be whole in a world that demanded you be less." As they lay together afterward, watching Terra Nova's moons rise through the viewport, Vexera thought of the message their relationship sent to both their worlds. Between them, they had created something revolutionary, a space where vulnerability became strength, where differences enriched rather than divided, where love transcended not just species but ideology. Her people had called her defective, but Ethan had shown her she was perfect, not because she lacked flaws, but because her capacity to feel made her completely, authentically herself. And in that authenticity lay a power greater than any form of control her world had tried to impose. The tears that had once been her shame were now her liberation. In each droplet was reflected not weakness but the infinite possibility of a heart fully awakened, finally free to love and be loved exactly as she was.